would you like to go all the way back to Chris Brown? Because I sort of found a link, I guess an ironic link, but a link in the way that there was like the gendered violence and then the turning it into like the sexualized intimate violence. So sort of taking what men like used against women to use against women. Do you see where I'm going with that?
Well, I can talk a little bit about it insofar as it was picked up in feminist critique. I guess
Yeah.
it was a little bit unusual for a pop culture incident in that it received quite a bit of commentary from feminist academics and a little bit of controversy too, because there were some who said that Rihanna was just, of course, speaking about her experience, and it was, of course, her choice about whether she wanted to speak about the incident or not. But there was that incident with the Oprah Winfrey interview where Rihanna had claimed to have forgiven Brown and even said, I think at one point, that she felt a little protective over him. So this was contrary to the more usual feminist script of kind of silence breaking, in that she was not sort of disowning him, at least not at that stage. And it was quite controversial about whether she was actually sort of romanticizing the incident or perhaps not speaking out against him as clearly as she might have, not being the spokesperson against domestic violence that some thought she could have been or should have been at that stage. So there were a lot of sort of political moral judgments being made at the time about how she handled the press, especially that Oprah interview, after the incident. And then there was, again, another layer of legitimate criticism that, of course, it was up to Rihanna herself as to how she would like to speak or not speak about her experiences. And there was that awful leaked photo, which was very confronting, of the injured face of Rihanna. But that photo itself was actually picked up in some feminist academic criticism. One academic suggested that her closed eyes in the police photo of her injured face were also a way of refusing to engage with racialized violence, so that her silence was in a way a kind of refusal. But then there were so-called white feminists who were suggesting that Rihanna may have been romanticizing domestic violence in some of her later music video clips, which seem to at least mirror the Chris Brown episode. There was that scene in the video for We Found Love, for example, where there was that simulated fight between Rihanna and her on-screen boyfriend in a car. And again, there was some critics at the time who said that this could have been seen as romanticizing the real world, real life violence that had occurred. But then, as I say, then there were black feminists who were saying that that was a simplistic critique from white feminism, and that it was sort of patronizing and misunderstanding Rihanna's art and taking it too literally. So it's kind of I don't know if this is making much sense, but there's a little bit of a kind of debate or controversy between so-called white feminism, which suggested that Rihanna was perhaps romanticizing domestic violence in some of her on-screen star persona images. And then there was the so-called black feminist argument, which was suggesting that white feminists were being too simplistic and too literal in their criticism of Rihanna's imagery. So that's a rather long-winded. How did that? What do you think? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it just sort of raises questions with me. So, how would it sit with the fans, I guess? Because if you think about, I was sort of comparing the sort of makeup of the last maybe 4 albums compared to the first few, and it was leaning on that sort of badass feminist, girls can do better than sort of being mistreated, and not only domestic violence, but in all other sorts of ways being treated as second rate by men. It seemed to sell so well, and the everyone's like it just wasn't America, it was global. She got Emmys, and I guess the list can go on, but yeah, she just seemed to be such a success as well. Would you say she'd sort of found a niche, like not a niche, that's a totally wrong word, but a sort of place where people wanted to hear her voice, and building from her incident with Brown, it's sort of spurred into a bigger thing? Am I making sense?
Yes, it is making sense. I know what you're saying. And she has kind of fallen into that. I know what you're saying. It's not maybe not a niche, but it has become a kind of cliche almost, the kind of rule-breaking, empowered girl power image. I think because it's become so commercialized and it's been around for so long as a kind of discourse of pop culture imagery. So for me, of my Generation X cohort, I sort of naturally associate that with Madonna as being kind of like the pioneer in some sense of that empowered, self-objectifying pop icon who integrated these kinds of feminist and post-feminist discourses into her video clips and interviews and sort of mythology.
Yeah.
So Rihanna's definitely followed in that footsteps. You're absolutely right. But I think what's interesting is the way she's been even more commercially successful than Madonna in doing that, which is quite shocking, really, because what prompted me to think a little bit more about Rihanna is Ms. magazine, which is a popular feminist magazine, named her as number 2 on its 2021 list of best feminist pop culture moments. And apparently she's the first female billionaire in pop music history. So again, that was pretty surprising for me. I was surprised to hear that she sort of had surpassed Madonna, the ultimate sort of empowered girl power kind of pop icon. And the real question is how and why. And I think you're right that we don't want to sound too cynical about it, but there's no getting away from the fact that awful incident of gendered violence did attract a lot of media attention and a lot of controversy. And just as Madonna back in the 90s and 80s sort of thrived on controversy and used it to her advantage in some sense, so too has Rihanna. But of course, the question is that controversy a form of exploitation? It may serve her as an individual in a sort of liberal feminist sense. It's useful to her. It's a very commercial discourse to exploit and sell. But does it really serve women as a whole, as a group? So these kind of questions really get back to old debates within feminism, whether you come from the liberal feminist camp that's more focused on the individual and celebrating this commercial success of the individual, or maybe a more radical feminist critique, which would suggest that, yes, it may benefit her as an individual to self-objectify, to essentially exploit herself for profit or commercial gain. However, does it really benefit women as a whole? Like, is she really such the great role model that liberal feminist pop magazines like Ms. have suggested that she is? So whether she intended to or not, Rihanna sort of has found herself in the middle of these kind of feminist debates about different schools or different camps of feminism, which suggests that maybe they're making a moral political kind of judgment in a way to suggest that self-exploitation, which is what you could say is going on here, objectifying the self for profit, is that really feminist? That's a kind of unresolved question, and there's no right or wrong answers. This is just something that kind of keeps coming up, I guess, and is becoming more and more timely now that pop culture has become part of our everyday experience, but also that so many female young pop stars have followed that Madonna template of exploiting one's own sexuality sort of aggressively for profit and selling it as a form of feminist or post-feminist empowerment. But where it got sort of more complicated with Rihanna was this kind of question of gendered violence that was literal as well as symbolic, and it sort of became layered into storytelling, such as in the video clips as well, which, you know, again, sort of featured images of eroticized violence. And there were questions about, is this really empowering for women, or is it just exploiting pornographic images in the way that male-oriented pop culture has done for decades? So, again, it kind of depends on your own sort of political stance as to what you think of that. I just thought it was interesting how she was kind of following the Madonna template. And she indeed herself, remember, had that famous quote where she apparently said to Paper magazine in 2007 that she wants to be the Black Madonna. And you're probably too young to remember, but I do remember that Madonna herself was the subject of leaked police reports in the 90s. I think it was 90s or late 80s. And yeah, sorry, what were you going to say, Ash?
No, I was just interested in finding out about Madonna. Yeah, comparing the two, I don't really I see Madonna as a queen of reinvention. Now I'm bringing my opinions into this, not really giving schools of thought, but like the queen of reinvention, where Rihanna's sort of made a evolution path. So she's just sort of grown bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with everything that she's sort of built in her empire. Does that have anything to do with what you were going to say about Madonna? I think
you're right. It's interesting. I see where you're going with that, and you're probably right that she hasn't had as many sort of image reinventions that Madonna has. She hasn't had so many different personas. She's always had that kind of badass, racialized hip hop persona from the beginning. But I guess how it's evolved and where it's hit controversy is it's become more and more kind of extreme. So there was that video clip that she released, wasn't there, where she tortures the accountant, better have my money or something, where there's a torture scene, and it's almost reminiscent of violent pornography in some scenes, or torture pornography. You know, do you know the clip I'm talking about, where there's chainsaws and torture implements, and there's a blood-soaked accountant at the end, and she, I think, walks towards the lens at the end with blood over her and so forth, and it's sort of like a revenge fantasy. So we thought back in the 90s that when Madonna went through her hanky-panky period, that was quite controversial. And it was at the time because, you know, she went through that one reinvention where she presented herself as a kind of whip-cracking dominatrix in her hanky-panky period. But from memory, that wasn't much of a commercial success compared to her earlier work. But Rihanna has just gone from strength to strength and is a huge commercial success. And I think part of that is the rise of hip hop. You know, she's sort of coincided very well with the mainstreaming of hip hop, and especially that kind of almost pornographic element of hip hop imagery in the music videos. And Rihanna seems to have captured that moment and sort of made it her own. But again, there's questions about, well, is that really feminist to have that kind of pornographic exploitation? And I know that I've written about that scene that I personally found quite confronting and disturbing in that video clip, where she kidnaps a white woman and apparently the wife of the accountant in this narrative, in the music video narrative. And it looks like she's torturing her, or she certainly kidnaps her. And at one point, the woman is stripped and hung upside down, and it's very upsetting and confronting. I thought so anyway. I was quite shocked. I could see why. I think it was only available for limited release or something. But of course, you can easily access it on YouTube. I think it has over 160 million views or something. So, that's part of the cultural trend, isn't it? This mainstreaming of pornographic imagery and very violent, sexualized imagery. So back in the 90s, that would have been considered very controversial. But Rihanna has managed to parlay that into this huge empire. And it's even sort of merged with her lingerie. Is it Savage or Fenty
it's
X?
called it's Savage by X Fenty. So I don't know whether the X stands for bi, like as in BY, but that's the label. And I don't know if you've had a chance to catch it, but at the end of October, she released her latest line came out, and it was actually a bit hard for me to watch. It was just very dark and erotic, and that's fine. It's lingerie, but the storylines was twisted, and it was set in a dark forest and people dancing around in underwear. Like, it was just, I don't understand who enjoys watching a 45-minute display of people running around, sort of, as you say, the intimate violence aspect. Well, I didn't. But I'm not 18 years old. So, so it has leaked into that. Not really the beauty line. I couldn't see a link there, but she's made a lot of money outside music. So it's that real empire of things building on things. So we've got, and she's even got a fashion brand. So she's the first person of color to have a fashion label in Paris.
Yes, well, she does deserve to be celebrated, and she has in numerous magazines, including Ms. Feminist magazine, for breaking through boundaries for women of color. There's no doubt about that, and being pop's first female billionaire is certainly quite an achievement, and she deserves full credit for that. But I personally agree with you that it's a question of taste. I found a lot of her material, personally, it wasn't to my taste, and I found it somewhat confronting and disturbing. Even back to, I think, one of her more relatively tame clips that was very commercial, the one she did with Eminem, was it I Love the Way You Lie, or what, that one sort of, did you see that clip? There was a burning house or something, but there was concerns at the time about that one too, that it was romanticizing intimate violence and a kind of a female masochism, was being celebrated. Some critics suggested in that storyline, the storyline of that video. And, Eminem has been accused many times of misogyny, and here she was collaborating with him. So she definitely does kind of blur the boundaries between empowered sexual subject and sort of sex object, or what Madonna famously referred to as, boy toy. So which is she? Is she sort of in charge or in control of her own objectification? I guess she must be, because, she's a billionaire. But again, it does raise questions about how liberating is that really for women as a whole? And also, is she really representative of vulnerable women? Because some of her critics say that well, she's speaking out for women, and she's a voice for vulnerable women and so forth. But really, now that she's a billionaire, she's perhaps not so representative of vulnerable women.
Yeah.
And maybe the messages that she's sending in her iconography, her images, her storytelling, maybe it's not that empowering for those who don't have many economic resources. I mean, if you're very wealthy, you can play with these stories and maybe feel empowered by them. But if you don't have many choices in life, you don't have many economic resources, it's quite dangerous and self-destructive maybe to be playing around with such ideas about eroticized violence. I mean, it could be self-defeating, rather than empowering. But yeah, it's a question of interpretation, really, like much of postmodern culture. Personally, I think that these are very sexualized, somewhat misogynistic fantasies that she is profiting from. That she's using and being used by. That's my interpretation of it. And I even think that that's evident, as you say, in the marketing of the lingerie, because a lot of the marketing, I noticed when I looked at the website, has a sort of S&M theme to it. And again, you could say, oh, well, she's just expressing diverse sexualities, and that can be very empowering. But personally, yes, I didn't find it very empowering, this kind of incorporation of S&M imagery and the selling of lingerie. But I think the real reason she's become a billionaire too is the fact that, the economic realities of reaching out to new markets. And that's something she's done, that she sort of was able to go far beyond Madonna and others who've self-objectified in reaching new markets with her beauty and lingerie products, especially with the success of her website. Asian markets, for example, and she's got the diversity of models on the website, which is obviously not just politically progressive and diverse, yes, but also, is it really a strategy to just reach into untapped markets and increase her own profit margin? And the answer to that is probably yes as well. So
I really think she's a good businesswoman.
But at what price? What price?
It's also in the beauty selling as well. I think there's like 40 shades, something like 40 shades in her foundations and powder ranges. So she's trying to appeal to everybody. So in that sense, she's been kind of celebrated for incorporating diversity and speaking to diverse markets. But on the other hand, there is that critique, and I've made it myself, that she's really maybe just drawing Black and Asian and ethnic minority markets into that American consumerist dream of sort of individual empowerment, like buy this product and you will be empowered. That's the kind of hidden message in much of the marketing, and I'm not sure personally I'm buying that myself. I'm not sure I'm convinced and drawn into that sort of consumerist dream. I mean, looking at it critically, you could ask the question, I mean, what is she really selling? Because it's not just the product by itself, is it? It's all tied in with this eroticized violence and this dream of empowerment through self-objectification, and some of it's quite pornographic and masochistic. So whether one finds that empowering or not is a kind of question that's open to debate. Yes, and I agree. It's definitely not my cup of tea, but each to their own, as long as you're not sort of feeding someone, I don't know, really, really breaking the law and hurting people. I don't know. I'm just going to stop talking. One point that just sort of popped in my head while we were talking there, off the back of her working with Eminem and always wanting to sort of have that moment in the spotlight of controversy, Johnny Depp also appears in this latest video that's on Prime. now for the latest lingerie range. So that, like, that also, you know, when he was going through court with Amber, and then the last we heard of Johnny, he was doing that. And now the next thing we hear is he's in a Rihanna video, as you say, with the pornographic and intimate violence. So do you think that's a pattern too?
I think you're absolutely, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen those scenes, but it's pretty shocking. And it certainly is evidence for our argument that she is sort of pushing it to the extreme, and it's kind of controversy for the sake of it, or controversy as a sales technique, because it's hard to imagine a more controversial figure at the moment than Johnny Depp. And he certainly has been at least implicated in discourses of gendered violence. So to use him is, I would suggest, a little bit of a cynical sort of move, but probably a very commercial one. I'm sure it's got a lot of attention, and that's the problem of sorts with postmodern consumer culture, that it's all about the image and attracting attention, sometimes referred to as the attention economy, you know, that we're living in now. Absolutely. The attention economy, that, you know, getting attention by any means possible is the goal, especially of celebrities and aspiring celebrities. So, yeah, that's obviously what's going on there. But then we sort of need to ask, I think at least, our own sort of political moral questions about who benefits, or whose interest does this serve? Does it really serve the interests of women as a group to kind of bring in such a controversial figure? I don't know. Personally, I think it may be done a bit of a shock tactic that was used to sell product. That's my guess. But also, you know, that is the point of difference, I guess, for Rihanna, even compared to somebody who used to be considered controversial for the time, like Madonna, is that Rihanna's pushing it further into that kind of rule-breaking, wild, titillating kind of persona. And the more pornographic and extreme the mainstream gets, the more she and others like her are pushing it, you know, just to keep finding that edge of controversy, to keep attracting that attention in the attention economy, and to use it to their advantage, you know, to literally profit from it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like, I'm not sure. Again, I would not consider that feminist, although, as we started by saying, Rihanna was nominated by Ms. Magazine as one of the kind of feminist moments of 2021. And there are other commentators who've suggested that she is breaking through boundaries, that, you know, she is empowering as a role model. But I disagree. What do you think?
I tend to disagree too. I do. I think the money she's made from music totals 40 million. So you can do the sums there. So I think she's really got her business head on, and yeah, and using that shock factor maybe, I don't know. Do you think it's going to keep rolling, and she's just going to keep finding?
Well, who knows where she's going to go next? I mean, I think she's running out of gangster imagery, because that's the other thing that's been increasingly mainstreamed, I think, in recent decades, is that pornographic imagery, sadly, has become increasingly mainstream in pop culture, but so too has kind of gangster imagery and discourses, and the kind of hip hop merging with gangster imagery, and gangster entrepreneurialism, or gangster capitalism, you know, which Rihanna is sort of making her own line in and using it to sell lingerie, and using it to kind of to mark her out as more kind of like a more authentic hip hop gangster than maybe some of the other pop stars. So yeah. As the gangster entrepreneur, she's done very well. But we have to ask, is that socially responsible? What are the limits of gangster entrepreneurialism? Really, it's about advancing the individual at any price. The old kind of, what's that hip hop saying from another hip hop artist, something like, get rich or die trying. Is that really the lesson that we want to? That's it. Get rich or die trying. It seems to be like the kind of motto of much gangster entrepreneurialism in our culture, and it can lead to all kinds of destructive and antisocial behaviours. And it's not very socially responsible, not very egalitarian either, actually, because it's just really about individual mobility. It's just about the individual getting rich rather than giving back to society. So again, I kind of question whether it really is in the interest of women as a group, as a whole.
Yes, I agree. I don't think so. All right, she's doing halftime in the Super Bowl in February. What do you reckon we could expect?
Gosh, who knows? Well, I haven't looked at her imagery or media appearances for a while. I sort of moved on to, because you went off to Europe, and I dived into about 6 different projects since then. So the last I heard of Rihanna, she was pregnant. So she must have had her child by now, has she? Or
she has indeed. So she's a mum.
Okay, right. She's a mum now. Okay. Yeah. And she was very strategic in that she went to an opening or something in her own lingerie, pregnant. So again, she was celebrated at the time for kind of, pushing boundaries on what is considered sexy, because she was making public appearances at the time in kind of like a see-through lingerie and spiked heels while pregnant.
Yeah.
Then again, I still remember the days when Demi Moore famously appeared pregnant on a magazine cover. And that was back then considered controversial. So, yeah, she's pushing the boundaries, and that's very empowering, I think, for women as a whole, and to that extent. But also selling her own lingerie in the process, right? Because I think it was her own lingerie that she was wearing and that was, attracting all the media attention. So my guess is whatever she performs, maybe she'll be wearing her own, is it Savage X lingerie?
Yeah, Savage.
Wearing her own.
Savage by Fenty. And her surname is Fenty. Oh, her maiden name is Fenty. So she's Robin Rihanna Fenty.
Right. So I'm guessing there'll be some cross promotion there. Maybe she'll be wearing, her designer label, and maybe people will be buying whatever she's wearing. I don't know. So it's become so commercial. I mean, I remember the days when pop music was meant to be very kind of anti-establishment. If you think of, punk rock, for example, if you think about punk, it was very much about sort of breaking the establishment, breaking the rules. Whereas these days, what's considered rule breaking is really kind of just being part of capitalism, just, playing into it for individual commercial gain. So, yeah, I don't really think that's so rule breaking. I think whatever she does in that performance, she'll be selling a little product on the side, and, people find that empowering. Well, that's great. But, yeah, I don't think it's very rock and roll, personally.
No, me. And, yeah, responsible as well, as you say.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it'll be a very hypersexualized sort of performance, because that seems to be one theme that's continued, is this very hypersexualized self-representation. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of that going on.
Yes. RhiRhi. Where would we be without her, though, Susan?
So you're going to rush out and get your So you haven't bought any of the?
No, not yet. Yeah, I've got to buy it on Amazon after watching it on Prime.
Okay.
Yeah. So not yet. I might just have to watch that video again and pick out my favorite numbers.
Let's see if it, yeah. But you're right. On another level, I think you're right that how it's interesting how pop culture is taking this kind of dark gothic turn. Everything's increasingly dark.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's a response to the economy. I have read interesting critique that suggests that the more we move into economic recession, the darker pop culture becomes in response. Okay. So maybe things are going to get even more gothic. I don't know. Personally, there's a limit to what I can take. I mean, I found that video where she kidnaps the accountant's wife and hangs her upside down. And I found that quite nauseating. So I don't know if I think I'll avoid the Johnny Depp clip. Goodness knows what's in that one. Yes, right. But then I'm of a different generation. What can I say?
That's totally fine, Susan. Well, I might just say thanks for today. It's a great chat about Rihanna. Thank you for your time. I'm glad we got in front of microphones and had this conversation.
Yes, it's always fun talking to you, Ash, and thank you so much. And we'll have to get together and find another pop star celebrity to talk about and deconstruct sometime soon.
We will.